What happens when America's most sharp-tongued late-night host meets Hollywood royalty with a history of controversial exits? You won't believe what unfolds when Stephen Colbert goes head-to-head with Meghan Markle in what started as a seemingly friendly chat, but quickly spiraled into television's most explosive confrontation of the year. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds. Last night's episode of The Late Show promised to be just another celebrity appearance. But what viewers witnessed was nothing short of a complete meltdown that had social media buzzing within minutes. The Duchess of Sussex walked onto that stage with her signature smile, but by the time the cameras stopped rolling, tears were streaming down her face as she stormed off set in what can only be described as one of the most dramatic exits in late-night television history. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan settled into the guest chair. Colbert, known for his razor-sharp wit and ability to cut through celebrity facades, seemed unusually focused as he shuffled through his index cards. The audience, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface, applauded enthusiastically. As the show's familiar theme music faded and the red recording light illuminated the studio. Well, Colbert began with that trademark smirk that has made him both beloved and feared in equal measure. We have royalty in the house tonight, folks. Please welcome Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, humanitarian, actress, and someone who certainly knows how to make headlines. The applause was generous, but those paying close attention might have noticed the slight edge in Colbert's voice, a hint of what was to come. Meghan, dressed in an elegant navy blazer and appearing every bit the polished public figure, smiled graciously and waved to the audience. "Thank you for having me, Stephen. It's wonderful to be here." Her voice carried that practiced media training, smooth and controlled, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she was already on guard. The first few minutes proceeded as expected. Colbert asked about her latest philanthropic endeavors, her life in California, and her children. Meghan delivered carefully crafted responses, each answer sounding like it had been rehearsed multiple times. But seasoned Colbert watchers knew this was just the warm-up act. The real Stephen Colbert was still waiting in the wings. "So, Meghan," Colbert said, leaning forward slightly, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly, "you've certainly had quite the journey from Suits to the Palace to Montecito. Some might say you've mastered the art of the dramatic exit. Care to comment on that?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and the studio audience seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. Meghan's smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "I think that's a rather unfair characterization, Stephen. Every decision I've made has been about protecting my family and staying true to my values." Her voice remained steady, but her hands clasped together tightly in her lap. "Values," Colbert repeated, nodding slowly. "Right, values. Like the value of privacy, which you've mentioned quite frequently in various interviews and court documents. Yet here you are, on my show, after doing Oprah, after the Netflix series, after the podcast. I'm starting to think your definition of privacy might be different from Webster's." The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Meghan's media-trained composure began to show the first hairline cracks. "Stephen, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. There's a difference between sharing our truth and having lies spread about us in the press." "Our truth," Colbert echoed, his eyebrows rising. "That's an interesting phrase. I've always been partial to the truth myself. But I suppose when you're dealing with multiple versions of events, you need to specify which truth you're referring to." The words were delivered with surgical precision, each syllable calculated for maximum impact. Meghan straightened in her chair, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the steel underneath. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I've been nothing but honest about my experiences." "Honest," Colbert mused, tapping his pen against his desk. "Like when you told Oprah you weren't prepared for royal life, despite having access to centuries of protocol and an entire staff whose job it was to prepare you? Or when you claimed you weren't allowed to leave the palace, yet there are countless photos of you at various events and outings." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop several degrees. Meghan's jaw tightened, and for the first time since sitting down, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Those are oversimplifications of very complex situations, Stephen. The reality of what we experienced was far more nuanced than what could be captured in a single interview. Nuanced, Colbert repeated, savoring the word. You know what I find interesting about nuance? It's often used to explain away contradictions, like how you and Harry left the royal family citing racism and lack of support, but then your own father claims you cut him off completely. Your sister-in-law Catherine apparently made you cry, but then it was actually the other way around. The institution was cold and unwelcoming, but somehow you managed to secure a multi-million-dollar Netflix deal based on your royal connections. The audience was now completely captivated, some leaning forward in their seats. This wasn't the usual late-night banter they were accustomed to. This was something much more intense, much more personal. Meghan's voice took on a sharper edge. Stephen, you're taking isolated incidents and weaving them into a narrative that simply isn't accurate. The challenges we faced were real, and the decision to step back was not made lightly. Step back, Colbert said with a bitter laugh. There's another interesting euphemism. Most people would call it quitting. But I suppose when you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars and have book deals and production companies, it's easier to frame it as stepping back rather than walking away when things got tough. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Meghan's hands were now gripping the arms of her chair, her knuckles white with tension. You have no idea what it was like, she said, her voice rising slightly. The constant scrutiny, the lies, the attacks on my character. No one should have to endure that. No one should have to endure scrutiny. Colbert shot back. You married into the most famous family in the world. What exactly did you think was going to happen? That the press would just ignore you? That there wouldn't be intense interest in every aspect of your life? It's like complaining about getting wet after jumping into a swimming pool. The studio was now thick with tension, and the cameras captured every micro-expression, every subtle shift in body language. What had started as a celebrity interview was rapidly transforming into something much more confrontational, much more personal, and much more explosive than anyone had anticipated. Meghan's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble, and Colbert showed no signs of backing down. The real fireworks were just beginning, and everyone in that studio knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The question wasn't whether this would end badly. It was just how badly it would end. The silence that followed was deafening. Colbert leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Meghan's face as she struggled to maintain her composure. The audience held its collective breath, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented in late-night television history. Let me ask you something else, Colbert continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate, almost conversational tone that somehow made his words even more cutting. You've spoken extensively about mental health, about the importance of therapy and getting help. Admirable, really. But here's what I find curious. You've also admitted to having suicidal thoughts while pregnant, correct? Meghan's face went pale. Stephen, that's an extremely personal, yes, but also public, since you chose to share it with Oprah and 70 million viewers worldwide. Colbert interrupted smoothly. My question is this. If you were genuinely in such a dark place, experiencing thoughts of self-harm, why didn't you seek help? You had access to the best medical care in the world, unlimited resources, and yet you claimed the institution prevented you from getting treatment. Does that really make sense to anyone? The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Meghan's hands began to tremble slightly, and her breathing became more shallow. You're oversimplifying a very complex situation, she managed to say, her voice noticeably shakier than before. Am I? Colbert pressed. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you had two choices: get the help you needed, or use your suffering as ammunition for a future tell-all interview. And we all know which path you chose. The audacity of the statement sent shockwaves through the studio. Several audience members gasped audibly, and the crew members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. Meghan's eyes flashed with something dangerous. How dare you suggest that I would exploit my own mental health struggles for publicity? You have no idea what it's like to feel trapped, to feel like you have nowhere to turn. Trapped? Colbert's voice rose slightly. You were living in a palace, Meghan. A literal palace. With servants, security, and more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. If that's your definition of trapped, then I think we need to have a conversation about perspective. Money doesn't solve everything. Meghan shot back, her voice now carrying an edge of desperation. You can't buy happiness, you can't buy peace of mind, and you certainly can't buy protection from an institution that wants to destroy you. Destroy you? Colbert laughed, but there was no humor in it. They made you a duchess. They gave you a platform to champion causes you care about. They welcomed you into one of the most exclusive families on the planet. If that's their idea of destruction, sign me up. The exchange was becoming increasingly heated, and Meghan was visibly struggling to maintain her composure. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush creeping up her neck, and her hands were now openly shaking. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking slightly. The constant criticism, the way they controlled every aspect of our lives, the way they hung us out to dry when we needed support the most, controlled every aspect of your lives. Colbert's voice was incredulous. You managed to negotiate a multi-million-dollar deal with Netflix while still working royals. You launched a podcast. You gave unauthorized interviews. You sued multiple newspapers. That doesn't sound like someone whose life was being controlled to me. We were fighting for our survival, Meghan protested, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. Everything we did was to protect our family, to protect our son from the same treatment Harry received growing up. Your son, Colbert said, his tone shifting to something even more pointed. Let's talk about Archie for a moment. You've claimed that there were concerns about how dark his skin might be, conversations about his potential title. Very serious allegations. But here's what I find interesting. You've never actually named who made these comments. You've let the entire royal family sit under a cloud of suspicion rather than identifying the specific individual. Why is that? Meghan's breathing became more labored. We felt it wouldn't be right to. Wouldn't be right? Colbert interrupted. You were comfortable destroying the reputation of an entire institution, comfortable implying that the royal family is racist, but you draw the line at naming names? That's awfully convenient, don't you think? The studio was now completely silent except for the hum of the cameras and the barely audible sound of Meghan's increasingly distressed breathing. The crew members looked uncomfortable, some glancing toward the exits as if expecting someone to call cut at any moment. You're twisting everything, Meghan said, her voice now openly shaking. You're taking our words out of context, making us sound like villains when we were the ones being victimized. Victimized, Colbert repeated slowly. By a family that gave you everything you could possibly want. By an institution that elevated you from cable television actress to global royalty. By a country that initially welcomed you with open arms. If that's victimization, then I think we need to redefine the word. Meghan was now openly crying, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to form coherent responses. We lost everything, she whispered. Our security, our family relationships, our sense of belonging. We gave up everything for love, and they punished us for it. You gave up everything for love. Colbert's voice was now openly mocking. You gave up a life of service for a life of celebrity. You traded duty for dollars, obligation for opportunity. Don't try to dress it up as some grand romantic gesture when everyone can see what really happened. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, and it was clear that neither participant was backing down. Meghan was visibly distraught, her carefully constructed public persona completely shattered, while Colbert pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a skilled prosecutor. I can't do this anymore, Meghan said, her voice barely audible above her sobbing. This is exactly the kind of attack we were trying to escape from. Attack? Colbert's eyebrows shot up. I'm asking you questions, Meghan. Questions that any reasonable person would ask given the contradictions in your story. If you call that an attack, then maybe the problem isn't with the questions. Maybe the problem is with the answers. The tension in the studio was now at a breaking point, and everyone present could sense that something explosive was about to happen. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most dramatic confrontations in late-night television history. The question was no longer whether this would end badly. It was whether anyone would be able to pick up the pieces when it was over. Colbert wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice taking on an even sharper edge as he prepared to deliver. What would become the final blow? You know what I think, Meghan? I think you're a master manipulator who saw an opportunity and took it. You married into the most famous family in the world, realized it wasn't the fairy tale you imagined, and then decided to burn it all down on your way out. Meghan's sobs intensified, her mascara now running freely down her cheeks. That's not true, she choked out between tears. We tried to make it work. We tried to serve, to do our duty, but they made it impossible. They made it impossible. Colbert's voice rose to match her emotional state. Or did you make it impossible because you couldn't handle not being the center of attention? Because let's be honest here, you went from being a supporting actress on a cable show to being one of the most famous women in the world, and somehow that still wasn't enough for you. The studio audience was now completely silent, some visibly uncomfortable with the intensity of the confrontation unfolding before them. Several crew members had stopped what they were doing to watch, their faces showing a mixture of fascination and horror. You don't know what you're talking about, Meghan managed to say through her tears, her voice becoming increasingly desperate. The pressure, the scrutiny, the lies they told about us. No one should have to endure that. The lies they told. Colbert's laugh was harsh and bitter. What about the lies you told? What about claiming you didn't know who Harry was when you met him? What about pretending you weren't familiar with the royal family when there are photos of you as a teenager with Diana memorabilia? What about the convenient timing of every revelation, every interview, every carefully orchestrated media appearance? Meghan was now openly sobbing, her hands covering her face as she struggled to respond. I can't do this anymore, she whispered. This is exactly the kind of cruel treatment we were trying to escape. Cruel treatment. Colbert's voice was now openly contemptuous. I'm asking you to explain your actions, Meghan. I'm asking you to account for the contradictions in your story. If that's cruel, then maybe the problem isn't with the questions. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being held accountable for your choices. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch that no one in the studio had ever witnessed before. Meghan was completely breaking down, her carefully constructed public image obliterated by the relentless questioning. But Colbert showed no signs of backing down, his journalist instincts in full effect as he pressed his advantage. Here's what I think really happened, Colbert continued, his voice cutting through Meghan's sobs like a knife. You thought you could use the royal family as a stepping stone to even greater fame and fortune. When that didn't work out the way you planned, you decided to play the victim card and cash in on your grievances. Every interview, every revelation, every tear, it's all been carefully calculated to maximize your earning potential while destroying the people who welcomed you into their family. Stop, Meghan pleaded, her voice barely audible. Please, just stop. Stop. Colbert's eyebrows shot up. You had no problem airing your grievances on Oprah. You had no problem making serious allegations about racism and mental health. You had no problem destroying relationships and reputations. But when someone asks you to explain yourself, suddenly you wanted to stop. Meghan tried to compose herself, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, but the damage was done. Her makeup was ruined, her composure shattered, and her credibility hanging by a thread. You're being deliberately cruel, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Cruel? Colbert's voice was incredulous. I'm being thorough. I'm being the kind of journalist that apparently doesn't exist anymore. Someone who asks the hard questions, instead of just letting celebrities spin their narratives unchallenged. I won't sit here and be attacked like this, Meghan said, attempting to stand up but stumbling slightly as her legs shook beneath her. Attacked? Colbert stood up as well, his voice rising to match her movement. You came on my show, Meghan. You chose to put yourself in this position. You chose to make these claims, to tell these stories, to present yourself as a victim. Don't act surprised when someone finally calls you out on it. I'm done, Meghan said, her voice cracking with emotion. I'm done with this interview. I'm done with these attacks, and I'm done with people like you who think they can tear me down for entertainment. Entertainment. Colbert's laugh was harsh and bitter. This isn't entertainment, Meghan. This is accountability. This is what happens when you make serious allegations against one of the world's most respected institutions and then can't back them up with facts. Meghan was now moving toward the edge of the interview area, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her microphone. I came here in good faith, she said, her voice barely controlled. I came here to talk about my work, my family, my life, and instead you've turned this into a character assassination. Good faith. Colbert's voice followed her as she moved away from the interview setup. You've been playing fast and loose with the truth for years, Meghan. Don't talk to me about good faith when you've built your entire post-royal career on selective storytelling and convenient omissions. I don't have to listen to this, Meghan said, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to remove her microphone with trembling hands. I don't have to sit here and be humiliated on national television. Humiliated? Colbert's voice was relentless. You humiliated yourself, Meghan. You did that the moment you decided to prioritize your personal brand over your family relationships. You did that when you chose publicity over privacy, drama over duty, and victimhood over accountability. The studio was now in complete chaos. Crew members were moving around frantically, unsure whether to intervene or continue filming. The audience sat in stunned silence, watching as one of the most famous women in the world completely fell apart before their eyes. Quit crying, Colbert said, his voice cutting through the commotion with brutal efficiency. You wanted to play? In the big leagues, Meghan. You wanted to be taken seriously as a public figure. Well, this is what that looks like. This is what happens when you make serious allegations and then can't defend them when challenged. The words hit Meghan like a physical blow. She stopped struggling with her microphone and looked directly at Colbert, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt, anger, and complete devastation. You're a terrible person, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos in the studio. Maybe, Colbert replied, his voice surprisingly calm given the intensity of the moment. But at least I'm honest about it. Can you say the same? That was the final straw. Meghan threw her microphone to the ground, the sound echoing through the studio. As it hit the floor, without another word, she turned and walked rapidly toward the exit, her heels clicking against the studio floor as she fled the scene of what had become a complete public relations disaster. The cameras followed her retreat, capturing every moment of her dramatic exit as she pushed past crew members and rushed toward the backstage area. Her sobs could be heard even as she disappeared from view, leaving behind a studio full of shocked witnesses and a host who had just delivered one of the most brutal takedowns in late-night television history. Colbert stood alone at his desk, watching as the chaos unfolded around him. The studio lights seemed harsher now, the silence more profound. He had gotten his answers, or at least exposed the lack of them. The interview that was supposed to be a friendly chat had become a masterclass in journalistic confrontation, leaving no doubt about who had emerged victorious from this particular battle of wills. As the studio finally began to quiet down and the crew started to process what they had just witnessed, one thing was absolutely clear. This was a moment that would be talked about, analyzed, and remembered for years to come. The Duchess of Sussex had walked into that studio as a carefully crafted public figure, but she had left as something else entirely. A woman whose carefully constructed narrative had been completely and utterly dismantled on national television.